I heard it before I saw it. A deep, violent crack that ripped through the quiet like something being snapped in half. Metal collapsing into wood. The sound rolled up my private gravel road and punched straight into my chest. Outside, freezing rain glazed everything in glass. When I stepped onto the porch, headlights were wrapped around my 100-year-old oak tree, steam hissing into the night like the car itself was angry it had lost. Then the driver's door slammed open. Out came Karen Whitlock, the HOA head from Cedar Ridge Estates, staggering on designer heels that had no business anywhere near ice, gravel, or my land. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't check herself for injuries. She locked eyes with me and pointed like I'd committed a crime. "This is your fault," she screamed, waving at the ice on my driveway. She said I was negligent, said I should have salted, said I was responsible for what happened to her, on a road she had no right to be on in the first place. Standing there in the frozen dark, watching an HOA leader trespass, crash, and instantly rewrite reality, I felt it click. This wasn't an accident to her. It was an opening move. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I need to explain the land first, because that's where everything went wrong for Karen, and where she decided rules stopped applying to her. I live just outside the small town of Pine Hollow, Vermont, on a little over 3 acres that back up into woods and low rolling hills. My house sits far from the main highway, quiet and deliberately out of the way. The only way in or out is a long gravel driveway that I built myself years ago. I paid for the grading. I laid the stone. I maintain it every season, especially in winter. That road serves one property and one property only, mine. It has never been public. It has never been shared. And it has never, at any point, been part of Cedar Ridge Estates. Cedar Ridge sits about half a mile away, tucked neatly behind a sign and a row of identical mailboxes. It's the kind of planned neighborhood where lawns are measured, trash cans are timed, and everything is supposed to look perfect from the street. And for as long as I've lived here, Karen Whitlock has acted like she personally owns every inch of land within eyesight of that entrance sign. Karen didn't just run the HOA. She was the OA. Property values weren't a concern to her. They were a moral crusade. She talked about them the way some people talk about religion or politics, with certainty and volume, like disagreement itself was offensive. In her mind, authority didn't stop at the edge of her neighborhood. It radiated outward, especially toward anything she didn't like. And she didn't like me. Over the years, she cornered me twice in town. Once at the hardware store, standing too close, staring at my work truck like it offended her personally. She asked why I drove something so looking when people from Cedar Ridge used the same highway. Another time, at a gas station, she gestured toward the hills and said my fence line was visible from certain angles and that it reflected poorly on nearby communities. She never said her community directly. She didn't have to. The implication was always the same. I handled it the same way every time. Calm. Direct. I told her I wasn't in her HOA. I never had been, I never would be. My land wasn't subject to her rules, opinions, or aesthetic preferences. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I just stated reality and walked away. That kind of response drives people like Karen crazy. She wanted an argument. She wanted submission. What she got instead was indifference, and that was worse to her than open defiance. After those encounters, I started noticing her car more often near the edge of her neighborhood, slowed down when she passed my driveway, like she was mentally measuring it. The storm that night was no surprise. We'd been warned for days. Ice, freezing rain, rapid temperature drops. Local alerts told people to stay home, unless travel was absolutely necessary. I stocked up, parked my truck, and settled in. Rural living teaches you when to push through weather and when to respect it. That night was not a night to drive. My driveway wasn't salted because it didn't need to be. I don't treat my private road like a public thoroughfare. When conditions are bad, I don't use it. Nobody else is supposed to either. That's how private property works. So when I heard the crash, that violent, unmistakable sound, my first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. Nobody should have been there. No neighbor. No reason at all. And then I saw her, standing there by the wrecked car, already angry, already accusing, already certain she was the wronged party. That's when it hit me. Karen hadn't been forced onto my road. She hadn't gotten lost. She hadn't slid accidentally while turning around. She had driven up a clearly private driveway during an ice storm because she believed the rules didn't apply to her, because she believed authority followed her wherever she went. And the moment she realized she'd crashed, the moment she saw an opportunity, she didn't think about whether she was wrong. She thought about how to make it my fault. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a car accident. It was about control. Karen wasted no time turning the whole thing into a performance. I hadn't even finished asking if she was hurt before she started yelling. Not crying, not shaken, yelling. She threw words at me like weapons: liability, negligence, lawsuit. She said I was going to regret this, that people like me always did. At first she claimed she was perfectly fine. Then, almost mid-sentence, she grabbed the back of her neck and said she had whiplash. A moment later it became emotional distress. By the time she finished pacing in a tight circle on the ice, she announced she needed an ambulance immediately. The shift was so fast it was unsettling. I'd spent years working around claims and disputes, and instinct kicked in before emotion could. While she talked, I observed. While she accused, I documented. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. Wide shots, close-ups, everything. The car's position, the way the tires had cut through the ice, the angle of impact against the oak tree, the untouched stretch of driveway she'd flown up before losing control. I photographed the weather conditions, the glare ice, the warning alerts still visible on my phone screen. Karen noticed. Her shouting paused just long enough for her eyes to narrow. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Documenting," I said calmly. That seemed to irritate her more than anything else. I called a towing company and gave them clear directions. Then, against my better judgment, I let her step inside to warm up while we waited. She immediately claimed the couch like she owned it, kicked off her heels, and started dialing. Her tone changed completely when the call connected. Suddenly soft, breathless, wounded. I heard my name spoken like a villain's, heard my driveway described as a trap, heard her frame herself as a responsible community leader harmed while doing her duty. It was like listening to someone rewrite reality in real time. She paced while talking, gesturing around my living room as if it were a stage set. At one point she waved toward the window and said, loudly enough for me to hear, that this never would have happened if I'd maintained my property like a decent person. I didn't argue. I kept my voice low. Calm unnerves people who thrive on escalation. When she finally hung up, I told her the tow truck was on the way and asked, plainly, why she had been on my road in the first place. That's when she slipped. She said she'd come to discuss ongoing HOA concerns, not an emergency. Not lost, not avoiding another road. She said it casually, like it was obvious, like it justified everything. She explained that my driveway and fencing were visible from certain vantage points, and that several residents had complained about how it reflected on Cedar Ridge Estates. She said all of this while sitting in my house, wrapped in my blanket, after crashing on my land. I told her, again, that I wasn't part of her HOA, that she had no authority over my property, that she was trespassing. I said once the tow arrived, she needed to leave. She smiled at that. Not a friendly smile, not embarrassed. A thin, knowing smile, the kind that says the conversation isn't going the way you think it is. She told me I was being short-sighted, that situations like this had a way of expanding, that responsibility didn't always stop at property lines. Outside, the tow truck finally arrived. The driver took one look at the scene and raised his eyebrows, then quietly went about his work. Karen's attitude shifted again as soon as there was another audience. She leaned into the injury story harder, winced dramatically, and made sure to mention how dangerous my driveway was. The driver didn't comment. He just nodded and hooked the car. As they pulled it free, the full picture became obvious. The distance between where she entered the driveway and where she hit the tree was far longer than it should have been if she'd been creeping carefully. The tracks told a story she didn't want told. Speed, overconfidence, loss of control. Karen watched the car being loaded and turned back to me with a look that felt less like anger and more like calculation. "This isn't over," she said. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She left with the tow truck, still talking into her phone, still rehearsing the version of events she planned to sell. I stood there in the freezing air long after they were gone, looking at the scar in the ice and the bark scraped from my oak tree. That was the moment I understood something important. Karen hadn't panicked when she crashed. She hadn't been afraid. She'd been excited. Because in her mind, this wasn't a mistake. It was leverage. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call, a thick envelope sent certified, like she wanted the weight of it to land before the words did. I recognized the tone the moment I started reading. Stiff, confident, written to intimidate more than inform. It was signed by Evan Holloway, Karen's attorney, and it wasted no time getting to the point. According to them, I was fully responsible for the crash. Not partially, not debatably, fully. They claimed my private driveway was a known hazard, that I failed to salt or sand it, and that this failure directly caused Karen's injuries, emotional trauma, and vehicle damage. They listed everything she was now allegedly suffering from: neck pain, headaches, anxiety, lost productivity, all carefully stacked to inflate the number at the bottom of the page. That number made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just high. It was absurd. The kind of demand meant to scare someone into settling fast before they had time to think. But what stopped me cold wasn't the amount. It was the logic. They were arguing that I owed a duty of care to anyone who might enter my driveway, even uninvited, even during an ice storm, even when that person had no lawful reason to be there. They were trying to turn my private property into a public obligation. I read the letter twice, then a third time, and the more I read it, the clearer it became. This wasn't law. It was entitlement dressed up in legal language. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't panic. I called as Laura McKenna. Laura had handled my land purchase years earlier. She knew the property, the boundaries, the access points, and the history. When I told her what happened, she listened quietly. When I read her parts of the letter, she actually laughed, a short, sharp sound, and then immediately stopped. "Okay," she said. Now I'm annoyed. I drove to her office the next morning with everything I had documented: photos, weather alerts, time stamps, the towing receipt, my phone logs. She laid it all out on her desk and went through it piece by piece, asking questions, taking notes, connecting dots. Then she leaned back and explained something that changed the entire tone of the situation. Karen's case, she said, depended on one thing: pretending boundaries didn't exist. Trespass mattered. A lot. Karen wasn't a guest. She wasn't a delivery driver. She wasn't lost. She was an uninvited person who knowingly drove onto private property during a documented weather emergency. That alone gutted most of her argument. Then there was assumption of risk, the weather warnings, the ice storm, the advisories telling people to stay off roads unless absolutely necessary. Karen chose to drive anyway. She chose to leave her neighborhood. She chose to enter a private driveway. The law didn't reward that kind of decision-making. And finally, there was the HOA angle. Laura was blunt about it. Karen's title meant nothing outside her development. There was no jurisdiction, no authority, no magical extension of power, because she didn't like how my property looked from a distance. Her business explanation actually made her position worse, not better. Laura drafted the response herself. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't aggressive. It was surgical. She dismantled their claim line by line. She cited statutes, case law, clear definitions of duty and trespass. She attached weather advisories and referenced Karen's own statements about why she was there. She made it clear that not only was their demand baseless, but that continuing down this path could expose Karen to liability for trespass, property damage, and harassment. She ended the letter with a sentence that stuck with me. This office strongly advises your client to reconsider pursuing this matter. That letter went out the same day. For a moment, a brief, almost hopeful moment, I thought that would be the end of it. That Karen would read it, realize the ground wasn't as solid as she thought, and quietly retreat. That's what a reasonable person would have done. Karen wasn't reasonable. Less than 2 weeks later, Laura called me and told me she'd just been served. Karen had filed the lawsuit. Not only had she ignored the warning, she'd escalated. The complaint repeated the same weak arguments, but louder, longer, and wrapped in more dramatic language. Her injuries were more severe now. Her suffering more profound, her certainty absolute. Laura was calm when she told me. "This just moved from nuisance to turning point," she said. "And that's actually good for you." I asked how that could possibly be good. "Because now," she said, "she has to prove it." That was when I realized Karen had made her first real mistake. She'd stopped posturing and started committing. Once the lawsuit was officially filed, Karen didn't just double down. She reinvented herself. Every new document that came across Laura's desk painted a more dramatic version of her suffering. What started as minor soreness became chronic neck pain. Headaches appeared out of nowhere. Then came anxiety, insomnia, and something she called psychological trauma related to unsafe property conditions. Each filing layered on new complaints, as if repetition alone could turn fiction into fact. The problem for her was paper. Medical records don't care about confidence or volume. They care about dates, notes, and consistency. And Karen's records told a much quieter story than her lawsuit did. Initial visits showed little more than precautionary checks, no follow-up treatment, no specialist referrals, no long-term care plan. Nothing that matched the sweeping claims she was now making under penalty of perjury. Laura noticed the gaps immediately. Then discovery began, and that's when things really started to unravel. Karen was required to explain, in writing and later under oath, why she was on my property that night. Not her feelings, not her opinions, the reason, the lawful purpose. Her first answer was vague: community, concerns, visual impact, complaints from residents. It read like HOA boilerplate, not a legitimate explanation. That didn't hold up for long. During her deposition, Laura slowed everything down. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She let Karen talk. People like Karen tend to think talking is how you win. Under oath, with a court reporter typing every word, Karen admitted what she'd avoided saying outright before. She hadn't been responding to an emergency. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't been lost. She had driven onto my private driveway specifically to confront me about my property and how it reflected on Cedar Ridge Estates. Laura asked one simple follow-up question. And you were aware at the time that the property was not part of your association? Karen hesitated, then said yes. That pause mattered. From that moment on, the entire case shifted. Trespass wasn't a technicality anymore. It was a fact she'd confirmed herself. And once trespass was established, everything else leaned in my favor. Laura kept digging. She subpoenaed official weather reports from that night, not general forecasts, actual advisories issued hours before the storm peaked. They warned of severe icing and advised people to stay off roads unless absolutely necessary. Those warnings were public, widespread, and impossible to ignore. Karen claimed she hadn't seen them. That didn't help her. Ignorance doesn't erase responsibility, especially when the risk was obvious. Ice coated the roads. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Common sense alone should have kept her home. Then came the towing company report. The driver hadn't realized it at the time, but his documentation turned out to be critical. The report included distance measurements, impact notes, and damage patterns. Laura had an independent expert review it, and the conclusion was blunt. Karen had been traveling too fast for the conditions. Not racing, not recklessly speeding, but fast enough that once her tires lost traction, she had no chance to recover. The length of the slide, the angle of the collision, and the force of the impact all pointed to the same thing: driver error. Her own choices had put her into that tree. Karen's legal team tried to pivot. They argued that speed was irrelevant because the driveway itself was unsafe. Laura countered with something simple and devastating. A private driveway is not required to be safe for uninvited visitors during an ice storm, especially when the owner isn't using it, especially when warnings are in place, especially when the visitor is there for reasons unrelated to the property's intended use. Every piece of evidence Karen introduced only tightened the net around her. Emails she'd sent after the crash referenced HOA authority she didn't have. Social posts hinted at punishment and accountability. Even her communications with board members framed the accident as an opportunity to finally deal with me. Laura assembled it all into a timeline. Accusation, demand letter, lawsuit, escalation, retaliation. It wasn't just weak, it was transparent. That's when Laura made the call. She filed for summary judgment. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, summary judgment is essentially asking the court to end the case without a trial because no reasonable jury could rule the other way. It's a bold move, and judges don't grant it lightly. Laura's argument was precise. Karen was a trespasser. She admitted it. She assumed the risk by driving during a known ice storm. She had no lawful purpose for entering the property. There was no duty owed, and her own actions caused the accident. No amount of dramatized suffering could change those facts. When Laura finished explaining it to me, I felt something I hadn't felt since the crash. Not relief, clarity. Karen had spent years believing authority was something you could project hard enough to make it real. She thought confidence could bend rules. She thought titles could rewrite boundaries. Now she was standing in a place where none of that mattered. A courtroom doesn't care how loudly you speak. It only cares whether you're right. And for the first time since this began, Karen was about to find out what happens when control runs headfirst into reality. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected, almost compressed by the weight of everything that had led us there. Wooden benches, low ceiling, the quiet kind of room where every shuffle of paper sounds too loud. Karen sat a few rows ahead of me, perfectly composed, shoulders back, chin lifted, like confidence alone might still save her. When the judge entered, the room settled into a silence that felt final. Laura didn't waste time with theatrics. She stood, laid out the facts cleanly, and then sat back down. No raised voice, no dramatics, just evidence, admissions, and law. Karen's attorney followed, repeating arguments I'd already heard a dozen times, only now they sounded thinner, stretched to the breaking point. Then the judge leaned forward. She looked directly at Karen's attorney and asked one question. Just one. What legal duty did the homeowner owe a trespassing HOA official on a private road during an ice storm? The words hung in the air. Karen's attorney opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. He spoke about general safety, about foreseeability, about responsibility. None of it landed. The judge waited, unmoved, giving him just enough rope to realize there was nowhere left to go. She pressed again. Why was your client on the property? Oh, he shifted. Referred to community concerns. What authority did she have to be there? He paused. Said she was an HOA leader. The judge raised an eyebrow. And what jurisdiction does that position grant her over land she does not own, manage, or govern? That was when the room went truly quiet. The judge wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Her tone was calm, almost instructional, like she was walking him through something obvious that he'd been trying very hard not to see. She asked why a private homeowner should be required to anticipate an uninvited visitor during hazardous conditions. She asked how assumption of risk didn't apply. She asked how trespass could be ignored simply because the trespasser didn't like the answer she'd been given before. Karen's attorney tried one last angle. He argued that allowing summary judgment would deny Karen her day in court. The judge shook her head. There is no version of the undisputed facts, she said, under which a reasonable jury could find liability here. She didn't even pause after that. The motion for summary judgment was granted. The case was dismissed with prejudice. Just like that, it was over. Karen lost the right to refile, lost the right to tweak her story and try again, lost the ability to keep threatening me with the same claim under a new wrapper. The door closed firmly and permanently. I felt a release I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not celebration, just a deep, steady exhale, like I'd been bracing without realizing it. Karen didn't look at me as we stood. She stared straight ahead, lips tight, hands clenched in her lap. The confidence she'd carried into the room never quite made it back out. Outside, Laura shook my hand and told me we'd won cleanly. No appeals on the merits. No second chances. The law had spoken clearly. For a few days I let myself believe that was the end of it. I went back to work. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone every time an unknown number popped up. I thought, maybe foolishly, that even Karen would understand when to stop. I underestimated her. The first complaint arrived less than a week later. It came from town zoning. An inspector wanted to look at my property because of a report claiming unsafe conditions. The man who showed up was apologetic before he even stepped out of his truck. He walked the land, looked around, checked his list, and cleared everything in under half an hour. Then another complaint came in, then another. Junk vehicles, improper land use, environmental concerns, each one different, each one unfounded, each one requiring time, explanation, and paperwork. The inspector finally said what we were both thinking. This feels retaliatory. Karen couldn't sue me anymore, so she'd changed tactics. She'd turned to bureaucracy, hoping that volume might accomplish what the courtroom couldn't. If she couldn't win, she could at least exhaust me. And then came the posts, local community pages, vague accusations, warnings about negligent property owners, comments dripping with implication, but never quite crossing into something actionable. Enough to stir whispers, enough to keep her name in the conversation. Laura warned me not to respond. Not yet. She's unraveling, she said. Let her. That's when I realized the pressure hadn't actually been released. It had shifted. Karen had lost her biggest weapon, and instead of backing away, she was swinging everything else she could reach. The lawsuit hadn't taught her humility. It had taught her resentment. And I knew, standing there in my quiet kitchen, reading yet another notification about another complaint that went nowhere, that this was moving toward something bigger. The kind of confrontation that doesn't happen in a courtroom first. The kind that happens when someone finally believes their authority is slipping away, and they decide to grab for it one last time. Karen retaliated the only way she knew how, by trying to drown me in process. The complaints started coming in waves. Zoning, code enforcement, planning. Each one different on paper, each one identical in spirit. Unsafe structures, improper land use, environmental hazards, alleged junk vehicles. Things that sounded serious enough to demand attention, but vague enough to be invented. The first inspector arrived looking uncomfortable before he even stepped out of his truck. He walked the property, clipboard in hand, asked a few routine questions, and cleared everything on the spot. Before he left, he apologized, not for the inspection itself, but for wasting my time. Then another notice came. Then another. Different departments, different forms. Every single inspection ended the same way: no violations, no issues, no follow-up required. One inspector finally said it out loud while we stood near my driveway. "This feels retaliatory." He wasn't wrong. Karen had lost her ability to threaten me directly, so she'd turned to volume. She figured if she couldn't hurt me legally, she could still exhaust me administratively, make me take time off work, force me to explain myself again and again, wear me down through inconvenience. What she didn't understand was that every false complaint left a paper trail. Every cleared inspection added context. Every inspector who noted no issues found strengthened the pattern. She was building evidence against herself without realizing it. Then she escalated. I was outside one afternoon, fixing a section of fencing near the driveway, when I saw a familiar car slow at the road. It didn't stop right away. It rolled forward, paused, then turned up my driveway like it owned the place. Karen stepped out first. Behind her were two people I recognized from Cedar Ridge Estates meetings I'd never attended. As Elaine Foster, the HOA treasurer, and Mark Delaney, the secretary. They looked uncomfortable from the moment their feet hit the gravel. Karen, on the other hand, looked energized. She walked toward me like this was a scheduled appointment, clipboard tucked under her arm, expression sharp and confident. She didn't ask if she could be there. She didn't acknowledge the history. She just launched straight into it. She said Cedar Ridge Estates was expanding boundaries. She said it casually, like that was a thing HOAs could just decide. She claimed my property now fell within their extended area of influence. She talked about compliance, membership assessments. She hinted at liens without using the word outright. It was delivered like a threat wrapped in bureaucracy. I asked her to clarify slowly whether she was claiming my land was now part of her HOA. She said it wasn't optional. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. This wasn't posturing anymore. This wasn't noise. This was explicit intimidation. An HOA head, previously shut down by the courts, now standing on private property with witnesses, threatening forced membership and financial penalties she had no legal power to impose. I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone and called Laura. I put her on speaker. Laura didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was calm, controlled, and unmistakably final. She asked Karen to repeat what she had just said. Karen hesitated, then tried to soften it, reframing it as a discussion. Laura stopped her. She explained very clearly that HOAs cannot expand boundaries unilaterally. They cannot force membership. They cannot place liens on property they do not govern. Attempting to do so constitutes fraud, Standing on private property after being told to leave constitutes trespass, and making threats under color of authority can escalate the matter into something far more serious than civil harassment. Elaine and Mark exchanged a look. Laura addressed them directly. She asked if they were aware of what Karen was claiming. She asked if they understood the legal exposure this created for the HOA and for them personally. The color drained from their faces. Elaine spoke first, quietly. She said this wasn't what she thought the meeting was about. Mark nodded, clearly uncomfortable, and said they needed to leave. Karen tried to interrupt, tried to regain control, tried to assert that she was acting in the best interests of the community. Laura cut her off. She told Karen plainly that this interaction was now documented intimidation, that any further attempts to contact me, inspect my property, or imply authority would be added to a growing record, that the next filing would not be defensive, it would be offensive. Karen stood there for a moment, frozen between rage and disbelief. The power she'd been projecting collapsed in real time. Elaine and Mark stepped back, distancing themselves physically and legally. They walked to their car without another word. Karen didn't follow them right away. She looked at me, jaw tight, eyes hard, like she couldn't believe this was happening, like the world had failed to cooperate with her certainty. Then she turned and left, gravel crunching under her tires as she sped away. I stood there alone again, the quiet settling back into the space she'd tried to claim. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. Karen wasn't dangerous because she was loud. She was dangerous because she believed authority was something you could take by force. But the moment she tried to use it where it didn't exist, it vanished, and everyone watching saw it happen. We stopped reacting and started ending it. After the driveway confrontation, Laura didn't wait for the next complaint or the next post. She documented everything. The inspections, the false reports, the social media smears, the attempted intimidation, and the recorded call where Karen claimed authority she didn't have. It wasn't hard to connect the dots anymore. What had once looked like scattered incidents now formed a clear pattern. And patterns matter. We filed a harassment lawsuit, naming Karen personally and naming Cedar Ridge Estates as an entity. For the first time since this began, Karen wasn't the one making accusations. She was the defendant. The filing laid everything out in order. The initial trespass, the crash, the frivolous lawsuit, the retaliation through government complaints, the online defamation, the attempted forced membership, the threats of liens. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, and it showed exactly what it was: a sustained campaign of control after her authority had been rejected. The reaction from the HOA board was immediate. Within days, Laura received a letter from their counsel. The tone was nothing like Karen's had ever been. It was cautious, careful, apologetic. They acknowledged in writing that my property was not part of Cedar Ridge Estates and never had been. They confirmed that the HOA had no authority over my land and no right to contact me. They asked to resolve the matter without further litigation. More importantly, they removed Karen. The board didn't announce it publicly at first, but word spread quickly. Elaine and Mark, the same board members who had stood on my driveway with her, submitted statements distancing themselves from her actions. They admitted they hadn't understood the scope of what she was doing until the legal exposure became clear. Karen didn't take it quietly. She fought the lawsuit, claimed she was acting in her official capacity, claimed her actions were protected, claimed she was being targeted for doing her job. The arguments sounded familiar, the same confidence, the same refusal to accept boundaries. But this time they didn't land. The judge didn't dismiss the case. That alone changed everything. Once it was clear the lawsuit was moving forward, the HOA settled. They agreed to pay damages. They covered legal fees. They issued a formal apology. They signed an agreement acknowledging that my property would never be subject to HOA control, now or in the future. Karen was left on her own. She settled separately. The terms were specific: no contact, no public statements, no indirect references, no attempts to influence inspectors or officials, no related claims about my property. There were financial penalties attached to every violation. For a while, she followed it. Then one afternoon, Laura forwarded me a screenshot. Karen had posted online again, Vader. Carefully worded, or so she thought. But the context was obvious. She referenced private roads, negligent landowners, accountability. It was the same pattern as before, just dressed up enough that she believed it would slide. It didn't. Laura enforced the settlement. She documented the post, tied it back to the agreement, and triggered the penalty clause. Karen paid again. After that, the noise stopped. By the time summer rolled around, something unexpected happened. Cedar Ridge Estates voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. It didn't happen overnight. Meetings were tense. Neighbors argued. Financials were reviewed. Legal bills were discussed. And slowly, the residents realized something uncomfortable. They were spending more time and money fighting control battles than maintaining their own neighborhood. Karen's obsession with authority had poisoned the well. Without her, the HOA had no purpose anyone could agree on. Without the constant pressure, people realized they didn't need someone policing fences and driveways to live peacefully. The vote passed, and the association began the process of shutting itself down. When I heard about it, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. But it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after something long and heavy finally ends. Karen hadn't just lost a case. She'd lost the system she built her identity around, and she did it to herself. All I'd done was refuse to bend. Everything else followed naturally from that. Today, my driveway is quiet again. Not the tense kind of quiet that waits for the next problem, but the real kind. The kind you only notice after chaos leaves. The oak tree still stands at the bottom of the road, scarred but solid. The gravel crunches the same way it always has under my boots. Nothing about the land changed. What changed was the noise around it. No more letters showing up unannounced. No more inspectors pulling in with apologetic looks. No threats disguised as community concerns. No one slowing down near my driveway like they're measuring something that isn't theirs. The road is still mine. It always was. What this taught me is simpler than it sounds. People like Karen don't win because they're right. They win because most people get tired. Tired of paperwork, tired of stress, tired of being made to feel like peace costs more than surrender. That's the game. Wear you down until giving in feels easier than standing still. The moment that game fails, everything collapses. I didn't out-yell her. I didn't play tricks. I didn't bend rules or look for revenge. I documented. I stayed calm. I refused to let emotion replace facts. And when her version of reality couldn't survive daylight, it disappeared on its own. Karen didn't lose because I fought dirty. She lost because she couldn't accept a boundary that didn't move. And that's the part people like her never understand. Control only works when someone agrees to give it to you. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?